Hey everyone, welcome to the MAAF218 supplementary exam from October 2018. Let's get started on question 1. So as usual, what I like to do before I read through the information in detail is just look ahead to the question so I can see exactly what we have to do, so that it'll help us when we're reading the question look for the key information. So the first question asks us, part A, to calculate the per unit overhead cost to be allocated to these three respective aircrafts, I believe they are, TK-42, AB-46 and CZ-95, from the materials handling and quality control activity cost pools. Okay, so we know this is an activity-based costing question, and we're going to have to do some calculations to actually allocate costs. That's the first thing. We know it's worth 6 marks, so it's going to be fairly long. Next is we're going to have to do some additional work. We've been provided these additional per unit allocations from production setup and machining of parts activity cost pools. So use your calculations from part A, the information from the above table and the background information, calculate the total unit costs for TK-42. Okay, so we're calculating unit costs as part B. For part C, they're aiming to sell a product with 60% markup. Compare your activity-based costing to traditional costing to see how the traditional costing used by KFP is affecting their ability to remain price competitive and maintain its desired markup for each of the three parts. Okay, irrespective of your answers above, explain how they can use target pricing, activity-based management, value chain to make its pricing more competitive in light of recent market developments. Okay, so that's a lot of words. That's probably a little bit more complicated in a question that you'd normally see. It's quite hard to kind of see all these words and figure out what you have to do, but what we can do is just take it bit by bit. We can work through part A, understand that, and then we'll work through part B and so forth, and little by little bit it'll make more sense. So for the first part, what we have to do is figure out the per unit overhead cost to be allocated to TK-42, AB-46 and CZ-95 from materials handling and quality control. So let's have a look at the question now that we understand what we have to do. We'll just look through the key parts in the question. So first of all, we know that they're a manufacturer of aircraft parts. The three aircraft parts that they're doing are those three that we saw in the question. So CZ-95 is an old product which has been produced in high volumes, demand's been falling, and management suspects the declines because of overseas manufacturers selling large quantities. So those suspicions intensified when they lost one of their major customers because the customer was able to buy a foreign part for 10% less. Okay, so CZ-95 has got some price competition from overseas competitors. So for TK-42, the next product, and AB-46, they're more recent additions and they're more complex to manufacture. Therefore, they've got a price premium. But recent analysis by their marketing manager suggests the following. So number one, it's difficult to meet current competitor pricing for the CZ-95, so that's the foreign-driven one. Despite 20% increases in the other two, demand for these parts continue to grow, so they're not really price elastic. With 15% increase in the selling price expected in the current year, so they're putting up prices for those two products, and demand's increasing. And then finally, it's possible for them to keep increasing its selling prices for those two products by an extra 25% without any decline in sales volume. So they're currently working with the traditional product costing system, which is $84 per machine hour. And the current unit costing is as follows. So we have a look at this table. This is under the traditional, or the current per unit costing. Okay, so what we have to do is figure out, using activity-based costing, what the true cost is using these fixed cost pools over here and allocate them to those products. Okay, so let's start off with our product, with our part A. So we've got to figure out materials handling and quality control and allocate them to the three products. Okay, so to figure out how we're going to do this question, we have to allocate the total cost of the materials handling and the quality control. So this is how we're going to approach it. Let's start off with material handling. And we'll zoom in a bit so you can see it okay. So the total cost of this fixed component is here, 353,430. Okay, and then the next thing is we have to actually allocate that cost across the products with activity-based costing. So the way we allocate it is we figure out, okay, that's the total cost, so the cost that we're going to allocate to each of the three products needs to add up to that. How do we apportion it between the three? There needs to be some sort of driver. Okay, now the material handling that we're going to use is material movements over here, the drivers in this table over here. So the total driver is 144 units, okay, which means there's a cost per unit of that divided by that. Okay, so that's what we're basically going to allocate, but we need to figure out what's the allocation between the three products. So the TK42 so that this is total, this is TK42, this is AB46, and this is CZ95. Okay, so first of all, we need to figure out, we know the total cost, we know the total drivers, we also know the drivers by each of these products. So in this table down here we can see that TK42 has 15, AB46 has 25, CZ95 is 104. What we don't know, what we're trying to figure out, is these ones up here, and therefore we'd also be able to figure out what the cost per unit is. So the way we're going to calculate that is take the total and we divide it by that, divide by that, and then times it by the number of units. So this is how we're going to prorata it. And there is our numbers, and as a check what we're going to do is just going to add them up and make sure that they add back to the total, which they do down the bottom, 353,430. Okay, so that's basically the cost that we're going to allocate per product. Now what about the cost per unit? Well, we should be able to figure this out fairly straightforward. All we have to do is just divide this, the total cost, by the number of units. Okay, so we've got cost per driver, but what I want to find is cost per unit, like actual unit produced. So we know that the product volume is 9,000. So units product volume, that's going to be 108,000. That's 9,000, 15,000, and 84,000. So that we know that the total cost per unit, is equal to the 368 divided by number of product volumes. So we can just copy that across, and there we have our cost per unit. So all we needed to find from this question, from part A, was the per unit overhead cost to be allocated, which we've got here, the $4.09. So that's the answer there. So that's 3 marks right there, because we've done this for materials handling. So we just need to repeat the process now for quality control. So let's copy and paste this. We'll need to update our values. Quality control. Okay, so the total cost of quality control, let's have a look, is 706,860 per the table in this question over here. Now the number of units, well, the key driver that we're going to be looking at for quality control is what? Well, do you think it's material, setup, labor hours, inspections, machine hours? Well, when quality control is based on an inspection, right? You're inspecting for quality control. So that's the key driver that we're going to be using. So the total number of drivers is going to be 1,200. And the product volume we know is 108,000. That's going to stay the same. So the cost per unit is now going to be $6.55. And then now we can allocate these based on their driver. So how many inspection hours? So the TK42 has 180, AB46 has 216, CZ97 has 804. Awesome. So now this is calculated automatically. We'll just make sure that these actually add up to the total, which it does not. So let's just check the formulas. Oh, okay, so they're linking into the wrong one. Let's just drag those down. That's why checking is always important in an exam, especially under pressure. You're going to make mistakes. So whenever you do something, and it's okay to make mistakes, it's just important that you pick up those mistakes when you do them. So let's just sum those up quickly. 706, 860, so that works. Okay, and then the product volume, let's make sure we've got those right. Yep, so those are going to stay the same. So let's have a look at the cost per unit. Make sure we've done this right. So we've got allocation cost per unit is 11.78. Yep. 8.48, 5.64. Okay, perfect. So there's a full 6 marks for part A. That wasn't so hard. Let's have a look at B. So further analysis will provide the following per unit cost allocations from the production setup and machining of parts. Okay, so we've got a new table of information. So using our answers from part A, the information from the table above, blah, 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 calculate the total unit costs for TK42. Okay, so for part B, how we're going to approach this is, so we've been given some extra information around the overhead cost of setting up these three products. What we have to do is calculate the total unit costs for these three products. Now, the total unit cost is basically this, right? So previously, under the traditional product costing system, which is not the method we're undertaking, but this shows you the previous total product cost. Under the old system, we're saying that TK42 costs $31.68, AB46 costs $35.88, and so forth. All right. What this question is asking us to do is, under the new costing system, which is basically a different way of allocating costs, what is the total cost per product? Now we need to consider, so what is actually changing between the old system and the new system? So materials and labor are not changing, okay? They generally don't change. Activity-based costing is about allocating manufacturing overhead. So it's the fixed costs associated with producing a product, and it's figuring out what's the best way to allocate it. Is it allocating it so you're excluding them? Is it allocating it based on a dollar per hour, which is how they're doing it now? Or are they doing it as a means of identifying the drivers and allocating the cost based on that? So what we're doing, really, what this question is asking us to do is to basically replace this manufacturing overhead, which is determined using the old traditional product costing system, replace this with our revised estimate of overheads per unit, incorporating activity-based costing. So the way we're going to do this is, let's set up a new question down below. So we're still going to say TK42 and so forth down here. And we're basically we're going to revise this. So our direct materials, as I said before, are not going to change. So materials and labor, they're generally fairly straightforward. You know, you're going to build a tool, you're going to use this much steel, you're going to have this much iron, and you're going to use this much labor. So generally, those direct costs are pretty easy to allocate. There's generally not really any change in terms of how we account for them between systems. That's why they're called direct. Direct is fairly straightforward. We don't change this. Just keep that in mind. For these other ones, I'm just going to copy in the number that we've got in the table already. 2.16. Okay. It's really when we start getting to manufacturing overhead that we actually have to think, well, actually, what's the number going to be? Because we're not going to use this. We're going to use our new calculated numbers. So the first thing is we figured out what our material handling and quality control costs were already from part A. And they've actually taught us in the question to use that information. So let's put in material handling and quality control as our next two costs. The other information they've given us is production, setup, and machining of parts. They've actually provided us the unit cost allocations. So we've got production, setup, and machining of parts. The sum of those four things is basically going to equate to whatever was in here, manufacturing overhead. For the values of these ones, we can get them from up here. So for material handling, we can get that value there, 4.096, and then for quality control, we can just copy this down here. Now for the bottom two, they've actually given it to us in the question B, so we can see production setup. So what I'm going to do is just going to copy these, 10.26, 9.44, 7.03, and then these ones have set 2.52, 1.68, and then finally 5.04. So therefore we know the total total costs per unit are actually going to be, let's sum up all of these figures here. Now of course it says to round the calculations to 2 decimal places, so that's what we're going to do over here as well, just to make sure that we are following the question correctly. So that's how you answer part B and get full 3 marks there. Now moving on to part C. Okay, for this question, what we need to do, it's saying that the company aims to sell its products with a 60% markup on full cost. Okay, straight away, so we know that there's two methods of costing, right? There's the original way, the traditional costing that they were doing, and now there's this new activity-based costing. In either way, if they're saying that there's a 60% markup, depending on which cost base you use, the selling price is going to be different, right? So currently this markup is based on cost estimated under KFP's traditional product costing system, okay? So compare your activity-based costing calculations. So basically have a look at your ABC cost and add 60% markup to assess how the traditional costing is affecting the company's ability to remain price competitive and maintain its desired markup for each of the 3 part types. So the desired markup is 60%. Okay, so how are we going to address this question? So generally I'd structure your answer something like this. First of all, do the data table. And this is where the bulk of your marks are going to come from. And I note that this is actually a very high mark question compared to what they're asking you for. And it's got a lot of qualitative answers. So this is going to be one of the key questions, which is going to be distinguishing the merit students in this exam from the non-merit students who are just passing. So it's very important to be able to get all those marks. So how I would structure it is to put a table like this. We've got your products, you've got your costing like this. So we're going to put our costing for each product under the traditional and then the ABC as we've calculated. And then we'll look up the markup, which is just basically the cost times 1.6. And then what we'll do is we'll look at the difference, the impact on pricing. It's basically the difference between the markup under traditional and the markup under the activity-based costing. And then we'll make some inferences based on what we know about from the question in terms of whether or not they're reaching their targets. So first of all, let's insert the traditional costing amounts for each of the products. So we know that these are the amounts in here for the traditional, so it's going to be 31.68 for TK42, 35.88 for AB46, and 42.36 for CZ95. And for ABC, we already calculated up here from the previous question that these are the amounts here. Okay, so straight away what we know is that activity-based costing is probably the correct way of doing it. It really measures all of the drivers. It apportions the cost related to that product. So it's the true underlying cost of the product. So what we know straight away is that the cost margins have been understated for TK42 and AB46, and they've been slightly overstated for CZ95. Now, what does that mean for margin? What it means is because they're adding 60% markup, what they're going to be selling the TK42 is 50.69, whereas if they priced it under ABC and applied 60%, the price should be 76.37. So what this means is that they're actually understating the appropriate selling price for the product, so they're still incorporating profit in there. Now, vice versa for CZ95, they're actually underselling the selling price. So in its most simplistic view, basically what this question wants you to do is identify those things. Say that the cost margin is understated for TK42 and AB46 and overstated for CZ95. And the implications for cost margin is that TK42 is probably understating its selling price that it should be, and CZ95 is probably overstating it. So in its most basic form, that's what we need to say in the exam paper. Now, when you're actually writing your answer, I'd be a little bit more sophisticated than that. I would first of all come to your conclusion in the data table, and then I'd put your answer something like this. So first of all, I'd probably start off with the product CZ95, and we're just talking about what the difference is in cost and markup. So actually using those amounts, they're saying, for example, CZ95 under the traditional has a costing of 42.36. Under ABC, it's 37.91. This is an increase. This is higher than its true cost of 4.45, which means we're probably overstating the true cost by $4.45, or a difference of 10.5%. So really go into that level of detail in your written answer. I'm going to skip over it for the purpose of this, but when you're in your exam, don't skip on the detail in this question, particularly if it's worth 8 marks. Definitely don't skip on any of the details. So that's the first thing that we should be talking about. The next thing is talking about margin, repeating that for the impact on price. So saying that under the traditional method, the price is probably $7.13 higher than it needs to be. And now, this is where you really get those extra marks, is actually linking it back to the question, which is talking about implications for KFP's ability to remain price competitive. So obviously, if they're selling a product for more than it should be, or under a different cost method, then it's making the company less competitive, price competitive. So that's really the key point that you need to allude to, on top of actually doing your numbers and getting those right, is actually linking it to that price competitiveness, because it's actually linked in there in the question. Next, I would talk about TK42 and AB46. You can talk about these together to save time, because they ultimately have the same issue, is that they're under the traditional cost method, they're actually understating what the true cost of producing these goods are. So because that's the same for both of them, you can talk about it in the same answer, just reference the different numbers. Now, what I would probably say for this one, instead of to link it into price competitiveness, isn't that they're hurting their price competitiveness, but rather I'd be commenting that they have the capacity to actually increase their prices. And that's consistent with what it's saying in the question about it is possible for KFP to increase its selling prices for both by an extra 25% this year without any decline in sales volumes. So I'd probably just link that into the question, say of that 50%, 25% has been shown to have been increased without any decline in sales volume. So I just mentioned that in your answer. Next, I would just go through the numbers as we've done before and come to the conclusion that ABC, if they were to implement the desired 60% markup, the price should be increased to 76.37 for product TK42, which is an increase of 50%. And for AB46, the sale price should be increased from 57.41 to 81.88, an increase of 42.6%. And then our final conclusion is that based on these prices, the desired markups are not being met, considering the activity-based costing. And that's pretty much it. That's all you need to do to get a full 8 marks, is get all the calculations right, do the table like this, come to a conclusion around difference in cost and markup for each of the different products, and then link each of them into the implications for competitiveness. If you can do all of those things, you should be able to get full 8 out of 8 marks. Okay, so last part is D. So irrespective of your answers to the previous questions, explain how KFP can use target pricing, A/B activity-based management, and value chain analysis concepts together to make its pricing of CZ95 more competitive in light of recent market developments while maintaining its desired 60% markup on cost. Okay, so this question is actually specifying 3 different concepts that we need to use in light of KFP. So the concepts are target pricing, activity-based management, and value chain. This is worth 3 marks, so you need to answer 1 for each. Now, my recommended approach for this was actually to look up each of these concepts in your notes if you're not sure what they are. So for example, target pricing, we can look up in the chapter 9 around cost management, as well as chapter 4, which is performance measures. So target sales pricing is basically figuring out what the target price is that's based on market expectations of competitors' actions. In other words, what price can the market actually take for this product? Now, the target pricing could be used to set a lower price for CZ95. As we mentioned before, it was probably too high to find a price that the market actually demands. So customers can work back from the lower price rather than the higher price that would allow the desired 60% markup to be achieved. That's all you need to write for the first one. For the second one, activity-based management. So activity-based management is similar to activity-based costing. It's really identifying and understanding the key drivers of the business and then managing them and using them to make management decisions. So costing is one part of it, but it could also be around pricing, product or customer mix, cost cutting. So cost cutting is a good example. So let's have a look at the variables that we use to determine ABC, which are down here. So as you can see, there's probably a few outliers. So these were used in activity-based costing to allocate these costs, right? So for example, let's look for ones that are outliers. For example, material movements. There's only 144 of these, but there's 353,000 in costs, which means that on a per unit basis, this is actually very high. So the questions could be, can we get rid of this? Can we cut this down? Why is it so high to begin with? Should it be so high? Things like that. So that's how you answer that one. So value chain analysis. So value chain analysis is basically looking at all the processes, we'll go to unit 2, within the supply chain and looking for inefficiencies. So here's an example here. So it's going through each element of the business and identifying areas where there's non-value adding activities, and this can help reduce costs and so forth in the business. So that's how you answer part D to get a full 3 marks and a full 20 out of 20 for question 1 in the MAAF218 supplementary exam question.